Good evening. I'm Tammy Fitzgerald, the Executive Director of the North Carolina Values Coalition. Welcome to another night of the North Carolina Values Voice. Tonight we have part 2 of our episode with Congressman Dan Bishop, who represents the 9th District in North Carolina. Now, there's been so much activity in our state, it's likely that our audience missed the votes that Speaker Nancy Pelosi pushed to the floor on Friday night. And to be honest, I started reading the 1,815-page HEROES Act bill over the weekend to prepare for the interview, but I just couldn't finish. I'm still reading. What is your trick to reading and absorbing these bills in such a short turnaround before you're required to vote on them, Dan?
Well, it's not an easy task. I will say, and Tammy, you know, we spent a good bit of time together over in the General Assembly as you work there, advocating interests of rights of faith and protecting the unborn and things like that. So we saw each other frequently over there. And there's always a significant amount of work to be done, bill flow, and trying to become familiar with all the bills that are out there, including the ones that are on committees at your jurisdiction that I may serve on. But it ain't nothing compared to what the flood of stuff in Washington. So
I hear you.
It is and as a lawyer who always prefers to dig into details, I'm having to adjust. But I have a fabulous staff, and I do rely heavily on them. They're fine, young, energetic, intelligent, hardworking people, and they keep me up to date on things. I will say though, one of the things. I do not believe that I should vote in favor of any legislation that I haven't read. Now, there may be some pieces of it that are jargonish I can skip, but I've got to read the guts of it. I will say, as to this particular ridiculous piece of legislation, $3 trillion virtue signaling bill by Nancy Pelosi, no attempt to negotiate with any Republican. It was not a serious piece of legislation. I didn't feel the obligation to read it all the way through. I knew the component part of the significant parts of it, but it's sort of like my wife has a habit when she's reading a book. If she gets a third of the way through the book and despises the book, she carries on like the Baton Death March until the end and reads that book. But in my case, if it's no good, it doesn't get finished to the end. So at least I spare myself reading the trash that never should be passed. Democrats did pass that on a party line vote through the House. It is dead on arrival in the United States Senate, and we can all be thankful that the Senate is not led by the likes of Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi.
We sure can. Listen, do you think we're going to continue to see these secret bills that you labeled a socialist wish list masqueraded as a relief package? Or do you think Speaker Pelosi will begin to operate in a more bipartisan way to provide assistance to those who need it the most?
Well, there are troubling signs on that horizon, in one respect. I think we need to have the House back to work. We've been out of session for weeks and weeks and weeks. I'm in Washington now. Forgive my casual dress, but I did just arrive on the plane today. I have made public that I am going to come to Washington every week because in this terrible pandemic, the Congress needs to be here serving the interests of the American people. But it is a fairly desolate place. I mean, the Senate is in session, as they should be. The House is not. So I'm going to be here every week. I think we're going to have to get people back working in a bipartisan manner in order to make progress. I do believe that this $3 trillion virtue signaling bill is now gotten out of their system. And I think Pelosi will be back to negotiating a serious bill. We will need additional legislation. I think we'll need a recovery package designed to facilitate the economy's functioning as we reopen. I will say, I think we need to protect Americans of all sorts, businesses in particular, from an avalanche of lawsuits that would otherwise come. And I think there'll probably be more spending. People are going to be willing to spend more than I would. But there are going to be some things that need to be tended to. I think we'll get on with that, but it has been disappointing and continues to be greatly troubling to me that these enormous pieces of legislation turn out to be negotiated maybe between the Treasury Secretary and Nancy Pelosi, and maybe Mitch McConnell gets in the picture. But I don't even know in many of these cases even that Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader, has been meaningfully consulted. So that's what's wrong with us not being in Washington. But I do expect more for the legislation.
It's a waste of talent too, because there are people like you there who have years of experience negotiating legislation that's very complicated. You demonstrated as a state senator and state house member your abilities in drafting legislation, and so it's a shame that they are negotiating behind closed doors. And we wanted to play a short clip from the hearing before the House Rules Committee on the debate on the coronavirus aid and remote voting by proxy for members of the House. You were there and you had some really great words to say during the hearing, and we're going to play those now.
And I heard a lot said by Mr. Hoyer and other members of the committee that have well voiced the fears that we all experience. But I think what is different about this situation is the way in which we are reacting to fear, because it is not an unprecedented situation. In 1968-69, it's not even clear that there are any alterations in the proceedings of the Congress. In 1918, the Congress wasn't dissolved. Unfortunately, what this bill represents is a failure of leadership when leadership is desperately needed, a loss of nerve when courage is called for. Contrary, well, to Mr. Hoyer's point, this institution has always met in times of crisis. This House has remained open in the aftermath of the attacks on 9/11. And in 1861, with the Confederate Army a few miles away, by refusing to let members get back to the work we were elected to do, Speaker Pelosi and the Democratic leadership seek to enforce a vision of the House completely at odds with the vision of the framers of the Constitution, and in the process supplant the will of the people with the will of a liberal elite. Given that, it is no surprise that instead of a bipartisan recovery package supporting efforts of states to reopen, later today this committee will consider a bill that amounts to a socialist wish list masquerading as a relief package. That failure of leadership, which this one exacerbates, reflects the simple truth that members cannot represent their constituents without being here in Washington to debate, negotiate, and work with their colleagues. Instead of considering common sense proposals to allow all members to perform responsibly the work we were elected to do, this proceeds with a radical change to House procedure that would upend 200 years of precedent and irreparably damage this institution. So-called proxy voting cheapens and dilutes the people's constitutional right to have their voices heard in this nation's capital. I'm here ready to work with all my colleagues, and I will keep coming back to Washington every week as safely as possible, but confronting risk if necessary, to uphold the oath I took when I was sworn into this office. Thank you for your patience. I yield back.
Thank you very much.
Well, Dan, what a well-reasoned rebuke of the Democratic leadership in Washington. With Americans so distracted and gripped in fear over COVID-19, how can we make sure more Americans hear the important message you just delivered so eloquently?
Well, thank you for that, Tammy. I went to that hearing and testified because I thought the provision that was being debated about proxy voting is a it challenges, again, the very nature of what America is all about by devaluing, diluting, essentially dissolving its Congress. I mean, the notion that the United States House, which remained in session with with the troops outside Washington, Confederate Army outside Washington in 1861, and passed 67 major laws that kept the Capitol open to the public after 9/11 because it was so important, that we sort of lost our nerve in the face of this modern challenge is very troubling. We've had proxy voting rules before in the House. The House gets to set its own procedures. They were abused. One of the great contributions, I think it was Newt Gingrich's Congress in 1994, when Republicans won that majority, was to eliminate that. Now, it was only done then in committees, but chairpeople of the committees, chairmen of committees, would just have proxies. They just decided everything, and it was outside public view. People weren't voting for themselves, and now we're going to be doing that on the floor of the House. Yeah. So I just think that we need to. This has been a tough time. You can see that people react. Much of what we've done has been in the last couple months concerning the pandemic. Much of the official decision making that's been made has been largely influenced by passions of the moment, sort of an emotional response. Very understandable. But I think we need to let some time pass and let sort of reason catch up with emotion. I think the task of leadership, what I was attempting to do in that appearance before the Rules Committee, speaking to sort of summoning the visions of courage that we've seen exhibited by previous American generations, that we're the same America. That the task of leadership, I believe, is sometimes, if the principle is important enough, as you know, Tammy, as you know very well, stand in front of a freight train to defend it. And I believe that not infrequently the burden of leadership is to go and speak things, even if they are not necessarily reflected in an opinion poll of the moment.
Right.
Because they are right, and because people will be better served by that position. And I believe that I think the American people will have a greatly different view of things 1 year from now than they did in mid and late March and early April. And so,
especially if we remain shut down. And
absolutely, I think even if we don't, I think it will be evident the longer we go that the shutdowns, the cost of the shutdown is I mean, this is a prediction, of course, but I think we'll see that is not a tenable public health response. Mm-hmm. And we'll have to have other robust efforts to deal with pandemics as they come, but I do not believe it is prudent or plausible to flatline the American economy and to confine the American people to their homes. Mm-hmm. It's an extraordinary thing even to think about. So we'll see. I may be proved wrong. It won't be the first time, but I think we'll have a different view of that in the calm of a longer period of time.
Well, I agree with you, and I thank you for your statements about leadership during the Rules Committee hearing, because you're exactly right. What we need right now is leadership, not vacant buildings in Washington. But I want to turn to another subject, talking about voting. I have to ask you about a provision that was found in Nancy's HERO Act. It seems like Democrats are taking every opportunity to mandate vote by mail for this election cycle. And in addition to the federal attempts that have happened here in Raleigh, we've seen both the State Board of Elections and the Democrat state leaders push for such a change. And then last week, Democratic legal groups filed a challenge to require mail-in ballots. And honestly, doing away with attestation of those ballots, like you don't have to have a witness anymore. And so would you explain what's going on and why the Democratic Party is turning to Hillary Clinton's high-priced attorney, Mark Elias, just 5 months before early voting is set to begin?
You know, Tammy, sometimes it's hard for me to address some things in a way that is constructive, and I'm at the very limits of my ability there. You know, I ran for this seat in a special election that followed just a horrendous betrayal of Mark Harris, who was the candidate in the general election for, in my judgment, trumped up accusations that were but they surrounded how absentee ballots by mail were handled, and it followed a path of election after election after election for decades, yes, in which Democrats organized efforts to go and, I mean, sort of to go door to door to people to solicit their absentee ballots and to, quote, help them fill them out. And so they call it ballot harvesting, because if it goes too far, you know, the lines there, it's what we call an unpoliceable transaction. You have people who are going to the door, maybe of someone who's older or infirm, to solicit them to vote their absentee ballot. And as far as encouraging people to vote, that's fine. But if you're encouraging them to vote for one side, you can do that. And then the question becomes, when does the influence become undue? What is the possibility that people get those ballots and just forge them? What is the possibility that you do witnessing after the fact that has not really been witnessed in person? And what about taking the ballots and putting them in the mail? So Democrats had sort of abused that forever in a couple of counties, and so there were allegations about that concerning the Harris campaign, and his victory was destroyed over that. And the Democrats were in high dudgeon about it. So Mark Elias comes down and takes a big part. You know, he's the Clinton lawyer and Obama, Eric Holder accomplice.
Well, he had represented Governor Cooper the election before.
Absolutely.
In the same kind of
They switched sides. They switched sides so shamelessly that it is brazen. So after he crucified Mark Harris for something that was never was shown to have been sufficient enough to affect the vote totals there, but did cost Mark so dearly in so many ways. He has then turned around as soon as the General Assembly made some changes to try to avoid some of those abuses. And he's filed a lawsuit to invalidate the General Assembly's tightening of the process. And the Democrats have already institutionalized wide open ballot harvesting in California. And their very first bill that they filed upon retaking control of the House of Representatives in Washington was to take that and impose it on the entire nation, along with lots of other horrendous provisions that they're still pursuing. The HEROES Act also had nationwide same-day registration requirements. You can see, this isn't about relieving the distress from the coronavirus. It's about exploiting the misery and fear of the American people to push forward a socialist agenda and an agenda for ultimate, absolute power. That's what it's about.
Well said. Very well said. Well, I want to ask you, since arriving in Washington, have you had an opportunity to work with President or former Congressman Mark Meadows since he assumed the role of Chief of Staff?
You know, I will say that I've had some marvelous interactions with both the President and, of course, with Mark, who's a good friend, and was both of them were extraordinarily helpful to me in my special election. And the President, Vice President, you remember came to North Carolina the night before that special election. I credit them with my victory. I really don't think I would have won without their help, but they wouldn't have helped, I don't think, unless Mark Meadows had done a number of things months earlier to see to it we got on the right path. He's a fabulous guy, great servant of North Carolina, and now to the president. Now, I will say this, and I think there's probably something to be learned from it. Since the coronavirus pandemic and since Mark's resignation from Congress, going over to Chief of Staff, I have a hard time getting through to either one of them, to be honest with you. Now, I can get messages through their staffs, and I do, but they are so extraordinarily covered up. I worry about both of them. I think they're doing great work. I think the president's leadership has been exemplary, and I can't think, if the media were difficult to deal with over the previous 3 years as they were on their witch hunt to destroy him, I don't understand how he withstands it, but he's been terrific. I will say this, as I said, as we sort of touched on in other topics we've covered, one of the beauties of the American government is that it has a wide swath of people who are involved in important ways. And the nature of emergencies is to concentrate power and decision-making in the hands of a relative few. And then they get very busy. They're extremely covered up, and you can see that they become less available at all levels of government. And I think that's something that we need to loosen up as soon as possible, because not only the pressure that individuals bear in those circumstances, but inevitably the decisions that get made sometimes can be of poor quality. I think they've done great work, but I do think it's good to have as many people involved as possible.
That's great. I wanted to note for our audience that you serve on the subcommittee on emergency preparedness, response, and recovery in Washington. And so I'm sure you've been busy these days coming up with the recommended approach that government should be taking to maintain our public health and safety while also balancing the economy.
I have been, that's a subcommittee of the Department of the Committee on Homeland Security. And I'm pleased to, and I'm learning a great deal serving there. And on the Small Business Committee has been, of course, a sort of a hot bed also, because the Paycheck Protection Program has been, has seen, I guess, $600 billion plus routed through that machinery of the Small Business Administration. But as to the disaster preparedness subcommittee and the general situation we're in there, watching some of that, we created the Department of Homeland Security in the aftermath of 9/11, and it's done well. It's served an important role, but I do think this event, as I talked about before, and the way officialdom has responded to it, I think there is. We are in danger in some ways we're more susceptible to kind of overly government controlled decision making in the following emergencies than we have been before. And I see that I think so long as I'm not a libertarian. It's fair to say more that I'm a conservative, but I do have some libertarian instincts. I think our liberties are the individual rights of the individual, the dignity of the individual, which I think is the American secular expression of the religious principle that we're made in the image of God. That I can't think of anything more important about our lives as Americans than that. And so I think it's important to keep us secure and to keep us safe. But I believe the rights of individuals always comes ahead of a knee-jerk or a momentary impulse to tighten up. And so as long as I serve on the Homeland Security Committee and the subcommittees there on disaster preparedness, I intend to defend the rights of individuals there, as I will in every other aspect of my service.
That's great. I thank you for your leadership in that regard. Now I want to ask you about the Republican National Convention. We're just 100 days away from your hometown of Charlotte being the host for that convention. And last week, President Trump hinted for the first time that the convention might need to be held at an alternate location. He said that our Democrat governor is playing politics.
That series of tweets by the president this morning about whether or not he's going to be able to have 50,000 people here at the Spectrum Center like he hopes to come August, now putting Governor Roy Cooper on the clock. And just like a game of basketball, there was a whole lot of shots back and forth. An ultimatum from the President of the United States, who is now threatening to pull the Republican National Convention out of Charlotte if he's not, quote, immediately given an answer by the governor as to whether or not the space will be allowed to be fully occupied. The RNC expecting 50,000 people to attend.
But we now are really in a position where we have to put the science and the health and well-being of our community first and foremost. So as we're planning this, I'm sure there are a number of scenarios that are going to be worked through and over again. The one thing that is consistent for me is we have a contract with the RNC to host this convention, but we also have a commitment to our community that we will keep them safe and well. And that's where we're focused, and that will be our focus no matter what time of year it is. Our community thought that we'd be talking about protest and security and keeping people safe that way. And here we are fighting the unknown, COVID-19. And so we have to win that fight first.
So do you think that the continued shutdown, the governor is apparently he's going to continue this for a while, that's part of the reason is to play politics with hosting the Republican National Convention in Charlotte?
I'll tell you one thing about Donald Trump. He is a very shrewd and the ability of the president to keep his fingers on the breadth of subjects that he is capable of addressing is really amazing to me.
It is.
And he also, I've found many occasions when Donald Trump had recognized or sized up a situation before I had. I would be hesitant to ascribe to any person the willingness to play politics in the way that envisions. But I've seen some amazing stuff, and I won't put it past a lot of politicians, I guess, these days to do something like that. I do think, whatever the motivations, there are lots and lots of reasons that we must establish the outlines of the governor's power by means other than his mere assertion of it, because he has proved that he's willing to exercise power beyond obvious constraints without much hesitation. And when he has encountered, frankly, I'm going to say this, when Governor Cooper has encountered lack of agreement in the General Assembly to things like expanding Medicaid, for example, he's been willing to throw the entire state budget making process into the trash dumpster over his one insistence. By the same token, as you said, when the Council of State raised questions about the draconian orders he was issuing and his failure to consult with the Council of State, which is enshrined in our state constitution because of the fact that our founders in this state did not trust executive authority and therefore split it among multiple constitutional officers rather than vesting it in one person. Mm-hmm. He's just disregarded it, put his head down and gone forward, riding roughshod over the rights of people. So is it impossible that he would do something like play politics? I don't think it is possible. And for that reason, that's another reason, as far as I'm concerned, that we need to do exactly what I've projected earlier in this conversation is going to happen in the next couple of days. We're going to test in court the rest of the restrictions that the governor has ordered.
Well, I certainly hope that when the hospitality industry and the restaurant industry are on life support, that Governor Cooper and Mayor Lyles and the Mecklenburg County government wouldn't play politics with with the shutdown orders and the Republican National Convention. You would hope they would be above that.
And establish what legal rights are, so that there's no question that whether they might be inclined to.
And that would be great. I look forward to that. Now, before I let you go, I want to again thank you for all that you've done for North Carolina. And I know your time is very limited, but I have to ask you, how are you and Joe adjusting to life in Washington, D.C.?
Well, Tammy, sort of my story. I had been in local politics, frankly, became fairly cynical about it, never intended to do anymore. And that was in 2008. For 6 years, I just practiced law. I really didn't read newspapers very much. And then there was sort of a one step at a time. Somebody told me along the way, because I was so cynical about politics, and a good friend of mine, friend of yours as well, told me, that's kind of a funny outlook on it. I know you're a believer, and God didn't promise us success. He promised us a cross, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was bowled over by that fairly obvious comment, and it stuck with me for a long time. But it was sort of a moment when, and then suddenly events started occurring. The first involvement, the first time I met you, Tammy, you may not even remember, was when the marriage amendment was being debated.
I do remember.
And I was asked to debate that by someone, and I hadn't even been paying attention to it. I knew it was on the ballot, but I didn't. So I got familiar with it. I was delighted to engage on that, and it was sort of the first step. And then they just started coming. The door opened to coming to the House of Representatives, and then I see, I was asked by Bob Ruccio to succeed him in the Senate and ran for his seat. And I certainly never intended or expected to go to Congress. And so I've never had in my entire life the sense of call that I've had the last several years, and it is palpable for me. And I feel I'm extraordinarily privileged and also significantly obligated to do my absolute best in Washington. It's a fascinating place to be. I've always driven into Washington and seen the Dome and the Washington Monument and the White House or the Jefferson Memorial, and it takes my breath away, always has. And I think a lot of Americans feel that way about it, although there's much about our politics today that tends to breed the cynicism that I described. But as for me, I know that a loving God has shown me, and I'm not the quickest guy to figure things out, but it's sort of been pounded in the head. If you just do what I need you to do, I will make your way for you. And so Washington is a fascinating place to spend some time. And Joe and I it's a very thrilling place. I will say, coming up right now, it makes me sad. I'm in the Cannon office building right now. 3 office buildings, for those who are familiar, along Independence Avenue that serve the House of Representatives are Cannon, Longworth, and Rayburn. And there's only one entrance in all those buildings that you can get into, and then you have to go through the tunnel network to get from one to the other. It is desolate here. Many people, and they're starting to, you see them on the streets and stuff at night going to get some food and so forth, but it's not the way Washington should be. So I think this too shall pass, but I remain invigorated to be here, and I intend to do my very best to serve you all here and to continue working with you on the important work that we have to do. That's
great, Dan. And I thank you for answering the call. It's obvious that the Lord has a calling on your life, and he's given you the skill and the knowledge and experience to be a great leader. And so we just thank you for your leadership there in Washington and the sacrifices that you're making, both professionally and personally, to be there.
Well, it's a privilege, and it's a privilege to be with you all tonight. And Tammy, as I said at the beginning, and find no better way to end, to say how much I value your friendship and the service that you've rendered and the trail that you've blazed, because it has been an immeasurable help to me.
That's very kind. I thank you so much for that. And thank you for being with us tonight. We really appreciate it.
I've enjoyed it. Thanks, Tammy.
Now, the weeks ahead will certainly be challenging for all of our leaders, the president, our state and national lawmakers, your pastor, and other local community leaders. Please remember to pray for them as they make difficult decisions to reopen our state and keep our communities safe. And please pray for Congressman Bishop as well. Now, I challenge you to remember your family's favorite local small business or restaurant and find a way to support them this week. As we work together to find a way through this time of uncertainty, your support is vital. If you enjoyed tonight's program, please be sure to visit ncvalues.org to watch past episodes of our program or support our work. I would like to personally invite each of you to join us in Raleigh on October 6th for a celebration of Carolina values. If your small business or church is interested in joining us as a sponsor, please visit ncvalues.org/celebration for more information. Next week, I hope you'll join us again at 7:30 p.m. for another edition of the North Carolina Values Voice. And we'll be hosting Jim Noble, a business owner and restaurateur in Charlotte and Winston-Salem. Good night.
Which of these issues do you care about? What if you could influence how they were legislated? What if you could impact the outcome of the next election? What if you could change the course of America?